Hi, I'm really pleased to be able to say we have Dave Croslands here talking to us today. Dave, a lot of the people who'll be watching this will know of you, but some people won't. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, a bit about your background and what you're doing now?
Okay, XU got very, very big, as in like 400-pound big. Subsequently, damaged my health quite significantly. Even while I was using, I'd moved into education, harm reduction, advice, that sort of thing. That's continued on. I have a harm reduction company called Croslands, where I advise people, both paid and FOC, in regards to as safe as possible anabolic use. But I also now run a blood testing company called Eval, which we specialize in servicing anabolic users.
Great. So tell us, how did you get into all this? You know, what was your motivation? Did you get into it thinking, I want to be a bodybuilder, or was it just something that you drifted into?
I was, from a young age, always fascinated with the cartoon characters. I was always a big lad, but I was
Well, you
always
became one of them, mate.
Yeah, I did, yeah. I was always on the chubby side, and I never particularly did well at sport. I did all right at rugby, but I didn't particularly do well at sport. My brother had a set of weights in the cellar, and I picked them up, and it just seemed natural. It was just something for me, it was always the training. So, though, unlike a lot of people that get into this, they get into it because they want to achieve a certain look. For me, I enjoyed the training. It was the training element, it was the pushing me, it was the challenge in the gym. I moved to anabolics not because I wanted to further my physical proportions, but because I wanted to further my ability to train harder. And then the interest in being big. I've always been I've always found that shape appealing and that cartoon character appealing, but it was more then that the size appeal became more of a factor. At 24, I had a very promising bodybuilding career and was very heavily tipped to turn pro. Unfortunately, at 24, I completely tore my left pec off, and I'm not just talking like I ripped out both major attachments and I tore it off the rib cage as well. So it was quite nearly just floating in free air by the time I'd finished with it.
So how does such a dramatic injury like that happen? Was it something out of the ordinary that you were doing?
No, I'd had a niggle for a very long time. So my left back had been painful for quite a while. Young, stupid, full of gear, bull-headed. And I'd recently met Dorian Yates. Well, literally a few days before. And I was introduced to him, and then I was then told that he had said if I could get in condition for the up-and-coming Leeds show, which I was already dieting for, he would turn me pro. So this was a huge opportunity. So I went back in the gym, fired up to hell, nothing stopping me. And I was incline flying with 120-pound dumbbells, and it was about the 8th or 9th rep. The left arm just went to the floor. Almighty Velcro sounding thing. And I knew what I'd done straight away. And I never really came back from that. I had my own business at the time. That was becoming demanding. I had a very challenging relationship on the go at the time, which continued to be challenging for quite some years. So it was easy for things to get in the way as well, but I just never came back from that. And that eventually caused me to stop training. I stopped training for about 13 years. Got into a rather large, fat, obese mess, and then decided to sort of start sorting my life out and get it back on track. And I came back to bodybuilding. So when I tracked, daft as it sounds, my progress from a non-trained individual who had not used, I trained naturally for 3 years when I started back. I did 5 cycles to hit 400 pounds.
Jeez.
That was it. People think I'd been on gear for years. No, just did 5 cycles to hit 400 pounds. And the first 2 of those were relatively mild. I mean, they were 1 gram a week.
Right.
It was only the last 3 when I started to ramp things up, and particularly the last 1.
And were you using growth hormone as well?
Yeah. For the last cycle, I threw everything in the kitchen sink at the job. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole and I see it in bodybuilders now, where you become very drug focused, and drugs are actually probably the third part of the puzzle and the least part of the puzzle. The primary part being training, but that's the bit that nobody knows anything about. That's the bit that people don't learn. That's the bit that people don't spend the time honing their craft. And I was at
I suppose ultimately that was what was the demise of such a promising career, was the training issue which resulted in that injury.
Yeah, I mean, I had no problem pushing myself beyond where I could go in the gym. There was no problem me being able to push myself beyond breaking point. That wasn't an issue. But when I came back and I didn't use growth hormone until post injury. So post injury, supposed layoff, coming back at it. Last cycle, I put growth hormone in. And I think at the peak, I was using 25 IU of pharma growth a day. So these were huge doses.
Yeah.
Did I grow any muscle off it? Not one bit. Not one bit. And that's when I started to question stuff like, well, does growth hormone cause muscular growth? And it turns out it doesn't. It has an impact, but it isn't this magic source that makes muscle grows. And unfortunately, that folklore is well rooted in the bodybuilding community, and it's something that you tend to find people who argue about this big perception that growth hormone. And this is one of the big problems. It is you have what's believed in the bodybuilding community that drugs do, and then what drugs actually do. And they don't always match, and sometimes they can be worlds apart. Growth hormone is a useful tool used correctly, but you only need small amounts.
But it's so cheap now, and people just, massive doses are affordable to anyone, really.
I mean, this is one of the big changes in usage is that I suppose we've seen this in a lot of drug culture. We saw it in the rave scene. In the rave scene, music was the primary attraction and the drugs complemented the music. And then slowly it became, no one had a clue what was playing because all they were interested in was the drugs. And we've had a similar track within bodybuilding use. It was always training case. I go back into the 80s when bodybuilding was very niche and it was everybody was focused on the training. They still used the drugs, but the drugs were secondary to the training. Now, guys are buying cycles before they've even stepped foot in the gym because they think that the key to growing is drugs. And as a result, we're seeing more. I'm seeing more and more abhorrent blood work. I'm seeing more and more health problems coming forward. And I dread to think what we're going to be sitting on in 10 years' time, particularly with stuff like Tren. The blood work I see of people using Tren, particularly kidney function. I've yet to see someone on Tren who hasn't had reduced kidney function, and sometimes quite severe. Now, in a lot of cases, it seems to recover post, but not always. EGFR is down in the 40s when people are on Tren.
And what's your views over the psychological effect of Tren?
Oh, it's a nightmare of a drug. Personally, I was never really heavily affected too much that was noticeable. It's difficult to say how much damage it did that I have yet to discover, because some of my health problems have only become apparent several years after I've stopped using. And I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see people stop steroid use because their lives change, they get married, they have kids, and things just change. And then 5-10 years down the line, all these health issues are going to start appearing and they're not going to know where they're coming from. But I mean, just real rudimental, basic online survey stuff of just open questions, I remember a brief one I asked. I was doing a quick talk and I just wanted some rough ideas of how people were affected by Tren. So I asked 3 basic questions. First one, have you ever suffered from anxiety whilst on Tren? And about 60% of people that have used Tren agreed they had severe anxiety, so anything that disabled them in some way. Had you ever had a severe aggressive episode on Tren? So not just being angry, but something that was potentially going to hurt somebody or get you in bother? And about 50% said they had. And then I said, of those that had suffered anxiety, how many had ongoing anxiety problems after they finished Tren? And about 30% had said that. And it's a very random, I mean, these are all very, just put together random, but some of the stories that were coming out of the aggressive episodes, one guy was on the motorway, got frustrated with the guy in front because he wasn't going fast enough as far as he was concerned. So he overtook him between the fast lane and the barrier at 100 miles an hour. Guys in traffic jams getting out and pulling keys out of ignitions and throwing them over the motorway and smashing windows, ripping wing mirrors off. The number of relationships that it had ended.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I suppose it has been one of my, and I'm not talking about the dramatic, horrific, things you hear, but just that damage to people's relationships, where it's just pushing people along a continuum. It's got to be a concern.
There was, I did get treated. It was quite a weird one actually, but I ended up getting in a conversation with a couple of girls who had ex-users as partners. And those relationships had ended over the use of Tren. And they said they got to the point where they were beginning to get fearful, particularly when it came to sex, because the partners had become hyper aggressive in sex. And it was no longer emotional, and they were very aware it was no longer emotional, and they were very aware that it was almost primal in the way they were going to get what they wanted, and if they didn't, they were going to make sure they did. And even many lads will agree that it makes them feel rapey, for want of it's not the best word in the world, I suppose, but it does describe the intention that they have this extra aggressive level to their sexual appetite. And I've seen it even in women that have dabbled in Tren. I mean, I've often wondered, and I don't see no reason why there wouldn't be, that the vast majority of female bodybuilders do tend to end up in the porn industry in some way or another. Now, their argument is female bodybuilding doesn't pay, and the porn industry pays them very handsomely because they're female bodybuilders. But there does seem to be a big change in sexual appetite in females that use high levels of anabolics as well. And then we've got paranoia. One thing that's been very revealing over lockdown, I mean, unfortunately, my social media feeds are full of bodybuilders. It's not really a nice environment in your social media feed, but it's the nature of what we do. They're falling apart. They are absolutely falling apart, far worse than I've seen in just general society. The other thing is they seem very high on the conspiracy theory sort of side as well.
Right.
So you seem, the bodybuilding side seems to be much quicker to jump onto the conspiracy theories surrounding COVID, but the state of people, because the gyms aren't open, and their inability to grasp the concept that when you look at the population en masse, the impact of a gym financially to the country is not that great, and actually the impact of McDonald's to the country is actually very great, and as a result McDonald's stays open and the gyms close. Now, I understand that there is a strong argument for the fact that transit within the gyms has been very low, and as a result now gyms are going to be staying open regardless of tier. But their inability to just look at basic facts because it took their gym away from them, it just seemed to be, they lost the gym and there was nothing else that made sense anymore to them. People just falling apart, absolutely falling apart.
It must be so damaging though for the actual, those independent gyms where the profit is pretty marginal to start with for many of them.
Oh yeah, I mean, COVID's damaged a lot of businesses, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of business continue to fall by the wayside, unfortunately, post-COVID as well, as they fail to recover. But I tend to, I'm a bit of a voyeur, so I'll tend to track people that sort of jump out at me. And I'll stalk people for years, quite literally. And I remember a young girl.
That's not a nice thought, that, Dave.
Not in a bad way, but I remember a young girl starting out in powerlifting. She was natural. I'd known her prior to this anyway, but not well, just knew what, I'd met her a couple of times. Anyway, she started out in powerlifting. She started using, and she was showing a huge amount of promise in powerlifting. Unfortunately, she got with a not particularly good coach who gave her some poor advice regarding anabolics. And though she wasn't using particularly large doses, she was on for a very long period of time. The girl I knew initially was quite fat, to be fair. But she was still confident and bubbly and outgoing and a nice lass. The girl now is just a nervous, anxious mess. But the slightest thing triggers her. She's outpouring on social media on a regular basis, where she used to have a sort of, what I'd say, a healthy relationship with social media, where she didn't do a dirty laundry there or any of that sort of stuff. There's regular social breakdowns on social media. The gym closures have absolutely ruined her life. She doesn't compete in powerlifting anymore because of injuries. I've just literally seen a girl damage herself physically, but damage herself mentally, to the point where her quality of life now is nowhere near what it would appear it used to be. Now, this is a very slight window I'm looking through. Obviously, I don't have the whole engaging picture, but it's not something that's uncommon. And I regularly see people. Now, don't get me wrong, I've seen anabolic use transform people's lives in a positive way as well, because it's given the confidence to be who they want it to be, which is then given them confidence to go for that next job and this, that, and the other. And I have a friend who has been using anabolics for 60 years. He's 78, looks about 60, incredibly fit. So it's not all horror stories, but the vast majority of people, I find, do end up in a negative place with their anabolic use. Even those that are knowledgeable will come a cropper in one way or another. Might only be slightly, but they do. I mean, my own experiences, I wouldn't say I don't have problems with anxiety, but I am aware that I am not as, want for a better word, chilled as I used to be. Things can stress me a little bit more than they should at times. And the one thing I always seemed to do very well with compounds was actually have quite a decent tolerance to their effects in that sense. Other people, I've just seen their lives fall apart. And we're seeing, both mental health and physical health problems manifest. There's more and more bodybuilders and powerlifters and strongmen dying at young ages. Obviously, it's not written off as steroids. It'll be written off as a heart attack, or it'll be written off as this, that, the other. But you've got to beg the question. Come on, there's a reason why these young lads are dropping dead. But mental health is probably the biggest single area of health concern, I would say, within anabolic use. And I think one of the problems is it's slightly self-perpetuating. One of the things I've found through anabolic use is that one of the side effects mentally is an increase in your appetite for risk. So you become more blasé about the risks involved with anabolics the more you use them, and your doses generally increase. And there's some science to back up the interactions within the brain to support that as well. And then you've got the interaction with dopamine receptors, and what is now regarded as a clinical addiction. And I've especially with tren as well, one of the side effects that you commonly see in tren is a coldness, a lack of empathy, not only towards others, but towards yourself. And so you get to a point where you sort of know something's not good for you, but you just don't really care.
You just become detached from it.
Yeah, you just become very detached from it. And that was the only real side effect I ever got from tren, was an emotional or a little bit of a coldness towards family members and stuff. And that was the only thing that was ever noted and fed back to me, that you get a little bit distant and a little bit cold when you're on that stuff. I do understand the popularity, but I don't, because of looking at probably a more fuller picture than the average user does. All they see is the fact they can still eat burgers and cake and remain abs. Where I look more at the, your kidney functions in its arse, and your emotional state's a mess, and your memory's starting to get a bit dodgy.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, and you're in a good position to answer this. When I started nursing and working with anabolic steroid users, and at the time when you're talking about with Dorian and that, the majority of steroid users were either bodybuilders or aspirations to be a bodybuilder, or perhaps working on the door and part of a culture. Whereas now it's very different, and the more research we do, the more different sort of typologies that we see, including people who are a million miles away from bodybuilding. And you come in contact with, I mean, you're very well linked to the upper echelons of the bodybuilding and the anabolic steroid community, but you're also doing the harm reduction work where you're coming in contact with, as I say, lads, and it is predominantly lads, who are using without any thought at all. I mean, what are your thoughts around this?
It's, quite frankly, I once posed a question. And I said, I basically put a scenario, and it was, I met this guy today. This idiot's been taking this drug. He doesn't know what it is, doesn't know where it's been made, or anything about it, and he's been taking it. And everyone was like, blinking moron, deserves whatever happens to him. I've just described a steroid user. Because we have no idea what's in that vial. We have no idea who made it, where it was made. We have no idea if it even is what it's supposed to be. Unfortunately, with the internet comes information and freedom of information. And that saturation of freedom has knocked down a lot of walls. Now it has enabled people to gain good information, but it has also enabled people to gain bad information. And bro science, as it's generally termed, has led a lot of people up the garden path. Motivations around use range from everything from I want to be Mr. Olympia and I'm the most dedicated individual on the planet, which surprisingly, you'd expect the pros to have the worst blood and the highest health rigs. And in general, actually, it's not too bad. To I'm going to Ibiza in 12 weeks time and I want to look good for it. So I'm going to do a cycle of steroids. And that is literally how people look at the drug. They look at it like we look at aspirin. If I want abs, I'll take this. If I want muscles, I'll take that. If I want to lose weight, I'll take those fat burners. And couple on that, more is better and stronger is good. And because we don't have, I think one of the biggest problems, and we're never going to get a situation where this is going to be solved, is we don't have enough awareness within the medical community to look for steroids as a potential cause of health issues. So as a result, we never draw the line. And so until we get more accurate data on, how many of these lads with cardiac problems, or how many of these lads with kidney problems, or how many of these lads with this problem or that problem have a history of anabolic use, then we're never going to start to really, in real terms, see the damage that it does. We can surmise and we can guess, but until we start seeing true data flowing back from medical services about the impact the drugs is having on people's health, you're never going to get across to the user that there are potential harms. Coupled with that, such a huge a huge mistrust between users and medical professionals. They don't disclose they're using anyway. And they're very reluctant to go to medical services when they have a problem. One reason is I'm busy. They'll go to the mate. And so, but you get this perpetuation of denial on such a huge level. So pro bodybuilders, they may be more aware of what the drugs can do, but they're still very much in denial of whether it's going to happen to them. Amateurs and very low-end grassroots users and casual users, which is what a lot of them are, don't even have the knowledge of the potential of the harm from the drugs, but they still have a huge amount of denial of what these drugs can do. I've seen bloods posted online that very obviously indicate problems. Maybe not severe problems, but things that need addressing. And they've been discounted as, yeah, well, that's what's happened when you're on gear. And you see this a lot. And though over recent years there has been an improvement in people taking a conscious effort and responsibility for their uses and starting to look at their bloods and starting to check their health, they then ruin it by just ignoring the results and fobbing them off as being, well, yeah, that's what happens when you're on gear.
I suppose with the increase of blast and cruise as well, you never really see if things return back to normal.
PCTs have pretty much gone. Some people still run them, but they are very much in the minority now. And the problem is that when people set their cruise dosings, they don't set it off what their bloods are. They set it off a predetermined figure, and that can often be as high. I've seen cruise doses at 300, 400, 500 milligrams a week. Yeah, that's a bloody cycle.
Yeah. But that, 20 years ago, that would have been a decent cycle as well.
I mean, more commonly, 125 milligrams to 250 milligrams. That's still going to put them
huge amounts.
Double natural range, if not nigh on probably 3 times natural range at peak. And what they don't realize is in the background, their HDL is continually getting lower, and their blood is slowly but surely, steadily thickening and thickening and thickening. And it's not long before we're seeing hemo levels at 180, 190, even touching 200. Now, you start getting up to 200, you'll start getting into stroke territory. Now, yeah, generally they're fit, they're active, they exercise, so that does massively reduce the risk of stroke. But what if they get injured? They're now sat at home doing nothing, eating cake with extremely thick blood. Now we've got a problem. And they've no idea. I haven't got a clue. And this is the big problem, you know, with the vast majority of users. They just have no awareness of what the drugs do. All they know is test makes you grow, Deca makes you grow, but it'll usually ruin your willy, and you might get a bit of water retention, which is wrong in both counts as well. You know, Tren is the god of all drugs. And this is the sort of approach to it. This is all they know. You know, test for growing, Tren for cutting, and this is how they look at it. It's so simplified. But if you remove drugs, I'd say probably 60, 70% of people involved in training would leave within 6 months because they wouldn't progress. So they've had no interest in staying there. It's the drugs that perpetuate them staying in the gyms in the first place. And it's, you know, like you say, it used to be bodybuilders. It used to be, and security was one of the careers that promoted steroid use. Mm-hmm. We now see it in the police force. I did a tribunal, literally advising a tribunal 3 days ago. Overlooked. It's been ongoing for a very long time for a disciplinary for a guy that caught using steroids at Manchester Police. But police officers have even said, I'm taking it to even the playing field with the criminals. The military, huge steroid
problems. Because with police, by definition, they're engaging with the criminal fraternity because they're they may not be committing a criminal offence.
It's a really horrible area to defend or prosecute in from a point of view of a disciplinary, because unfortunately the police legislation or the police employment is a bit muddy, to say the least. And it's open to a lot of interpretation of definitions when you get to it about, is that unbecoming for a police officer? Well, I didn't enjoy it. I bought it online. You know, and well, it's not criminal, is it? Why they just don't say you cannot use anabolics, pro hormones, and be done with? I don't know, but they seem to have this reluctance to go that way. The military, huge problems with usage. They couldn't get on top of it. They started losing too many men through other reasons as well, so they just stopped looking.
Yeah.
It was estimated that in the guards, 1 in 12 guards were using steroids in all the guard regiments. Yeah. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was what they estimated. It was rife. In 7RHA, which is not a particularly big regiment, they lost 26, I think, to steroids. Well, 13 in one go at one point. One of them was an RSM. And the military tried. They tried education, they tried discipline, and because of low morale, and they had a big problem with lads just leaving anyway, and certain regiments were getting close to collapse on numbers, they just backed right off and pulled out of the steroid stuff. And though they'll still throw someone out if they get caught, you know, they don't look for it. They're nowhere near as keen as they used to be on trying to discover it now. You find out with a lot of things. Armed response police is another area where you see higher levels of usage. But with, you know, you see it. I mean, look at the different sports, baseball players in the States, where you start to see steroid use crop in. You know, it's no longer the traditional power sports or heavy muscle sports that we used to view. It is just a cosmetic drug now. Heroin users using steroids because they don't want to look like heroin users anymore. You know, it's there's all sorts of areas now of development steroids. TRT, huge developmental area where middle-aged men are getting very frustrated because of the strictness of TRT therapy on the NHS, particularly when we're so heavily exposed to how liberal it is in America. So if you go online, you see loads and loads of TRT groups, most of them American based, and it's basically like you can walk into your corner shop and buy it. It's not quite like that, but you know, there is that sense of it being very freely available. Guys start questioning, well, I'm tired all the time and I do feel a bit run down. They convince themselves, or even they do test and they are on the lower end of the spectrum, but they won't get any support from the doctors because they're not quite qualifying. And it drives them into the black market. And that's another area I'm seeing a bigger and bigger growth in anabolic use. And unfortunately, the American trend at the moment is to run quite high doses in TRT, ridiculously high at points. It's very common to see people, and these are not users. They don't cycle. They're not into the fitness. These are just people that are on TRT. And very, very common to see people on 250, 300 mg a week.
That's not replacing when the person isn't going to be on that in the first place, though, is it? You know, it's.
Well, this is what I don't understand. I mean, it's, you know, you're probably looking milligram a week to replace natural levels, particularly if you go sub-Q, because you get that delayed and it'll stay in the system that little bit longer and give you much more levels, much more stable levels. But standard, you ask any bodybuilder what's a TRD, so they'll go, oh, 150, 200 maybe. And they judge it by feel, and it's just like, this is ridiculous. You know, you can't judge your drug dosing by feel. You know, right? Well, I'm on chemo, and I don't know. I don't quite feel that's enough. I'll have a bit more. Yeah, it's ridiculous. You've got to test your blood plasma levels, but they don't do it. And
Dave,
I think we'll see it.
Draw a line on this now. But what I was going to say is, would you mind coming back? Because I mean, we could talk about this for forever. I'd really love to get you back, and I'll probably, if it's okay with you, I'll ask for questions for people to put to you, because you've got a wealth of experience, and I think people would want to know your views on a number of different issues. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to stop the camera rolling. Thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you again really soon.
Pleasure.